When the screens went black, the sound in the command center wasn't silence so much as a vacuum pulling at everything that used to make the place hum. Monitors that normally glowed with charts and transactions turned into rectangles of dull glass. Phones lay mute on their charging pads. A row of LED indicators winked out like heartbeat monitors flatlining. In the glass-walled conference room on the 10th floor, Richard Sterling stood frozen with his hand on the back of a leather chair and a coffee gone cold on the table. His face had the raw color of someone who had watched a decimal point become an avalanche. By noon, a multi-billion-dollar company that processed millions of dollars in payments every hour had stopped functioning. Orders queued and evaporated into error messages no one could read. Trading links blinked dead. Employee kiosks refused to authenticate. Investors were calling. Clients were messaging. Somewhere down the building, the facilities team found the elevators stuck between floors. The security dashboard said their cameras were alive, but the feeds bled static. "Systems have failed," someone said. It wasn't a new sentence. It was a chant repeating down every corridor, a prayer and an accusation rolled into 3 words. Richard swallowed and felt the room tilt. He had devoted 2 decades of himself to building Techdyne into something that mattered. Now, in the glaring light of the conference room, he could see the seams of what he had built. Panic crept up his spine like cold water. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside Techdyne, time was folding on itself. Executives shuffled into the emergency room, tight ties, sleeves rolled, badges glinting like shields. Marcus Thompson, the company's chief technology officer, arrived last, unruffled in a way that made the others uneasy. Marcus's face was practiced, efficient. His voice could be syrup when he wanted it to be. He said the right phrases about containment and forensics, but his hands kept checking a watch that hadn't been set properly, as though a countdown he alone understood was running. Downstairs in the maintenance wing, another clock marked time in a different way. The janitorial cart squeaked like tired beasts over linoleum. The smell of bleach and lemon cleaner was familiar, warm and domestic in all the wrong places. Carlos Mendoza pushed one cart, steady and patient, sweeping halls that executives never walked through. He had come to this city 3 decades earlier with a folding suitcase and the idea that work was the promise you made to those you loved. When the building trembled with crisis, Carlos's shoulders tightened as if he too could carry the weight. Sofia Mendoza was not yet old enough to vote, but she had already learned how to parse patterns. 12 years old and small for her age, with a braid that swung like a pendulum when she walked, she moved through the building as quietly as dust. Where others saw extension cords and vents, she saw lines and rhythms. She never called it genius, she called it curiosity. On slow nights, she would sit in the security office or in a stairwell with a flashlight and textbooks, tracing sequences, learning the shapes of things adults pretended were mysterious. A security guard named Miguel had once lent her an old programming manual, thumbed and sticky with coffee stains, and told her to stay curious. She had obeyed. Sofia had been watching the monitors in the same way she watched the sky, looking for a pattern that would explain the weather. She watched Marcus watch them. He had lines that didn't match the rest of his face when people asked questions he didn't want to answer. He deflected, joked, laughed too loud at a joke no one else found funny. He had been in leadership so long he felt entitled to a narrative, and when reality didn't cooperate, he reshaped the facts until they fit his story. That was a thing Sofia had noticed, slowly, like the way a crack lengthened in plaster. In other parts of the building, people were making lists: who to call, what to cancel, what to salvage. Techdyne's PR chief paced, muttering about damage control. The legal team hovered like gray birds. Richard ran his hands through his hair and felt small. He had built a company that counted for millions. Now it counted for nothing while he stood there, exposed. Marcus spoke about protocols and false positives, about external actors and sophisticated malware. "We are under attack," he said on multiple calls. "It seems like a targeted intrusion." "Could be an inside job," said David Chen, the outside consultant the board had flown in on an emergency flight. He had a quiet, exacting manner, the kind of person who held questions like lanterns and looked into them with patience. He'd been through blackouts before, seen the residue they leave on people's faces. "We need to find where this came from, and fast," he told the room. "Find?" Marcus smiled too easily. "That's why you have us. There's no evidence of internal tampering, no traces in the audit that point." "But the log sequences are irregular," David cut in. "They're consistent with something that had access to privileged credentials. The question is how." Richard looked around at his team. The company was a cathedral of expertise.
They had servers that hummed with the company's heartbeat, engineers who had rewritten pieces of the internet for a living. And yet here they were, stalling. Their expertise had become a lock without a key. Below the polished shoes and the postured competence, the people who kept the building breathing felt the tremble. Housekeeping staff huddled in the break room with thermoses, watching the news feel their futures chisel away in headlines. For many of them, a day without payroll was not a PR problem, it was a grocery bill.
When the first rumors began to circulate about missing payroll files, about accounts wiped, about client data at risk, it was Carlos who called his wife from a hallway to ask if they'd pay the electricity that month if the company went dark a while longer. Maria's voice came over the line, warm and calm, and told them they would manage. They had always managed. Maria had a way of making scarcity feel like a temporary weather pattern. She organized pantry shelves in a way that always made the house seem larger than its square footage. Sophia listened to their conversation from the stairwell and felt an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't fear exactly, it was a knot of obligation. Her father had given up a lot to buy her the chance to learn. He worked late nights, wiped fingerprints from boardroom glass, mopped the threadbare carpets where executives stepped and pretended not to notice. He had once told her, in the small hours when the refrigerator hummed and the world seemed narrow and kind, "You learn not for me, mija. You learn for yourself." She had taken that to heart. At school, she got the grades that opened doors, and at home, she practiced the sort of habits people only notice when they lack them: carefulness, curiosity, the stubbornness to see a problem through. Those small things accumulated like saved coins. Sophia had seen the way the executives looked at her family. She had watched a vice president step over her father's cart as if the person moving the cart were air. She had seen Marcus smirk once when Carlos corrected a schedule, suggesting in a clipped tone that certain people were just not in the room for higher thinking. He had said in a conversation overheard by many that the company would be stronger when he referred to as inefficiencies. He had offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Words stuck. They made a shape. So when the systems failed, Sophia didn't feel the same helplessness that filled the conference room. She felt like the seamstress who had watched the fabric. It didn't make her powerful. It made her attentive. The first CTA, the brief tug for the viewer, hangs like a small note in the air now, because stories like this begin with a question. Where does rescue come from when the people with titles can't find a way? If you love underdog wins, tap like. After Sophia's sketch, the narrative leaned into her background. At school, she was the kind of kid who always had a pencil stuck behind her ear and a backpack heavy with books. Mathematics came to her like language, patterns and proofs that made sense in a way people sometimes reserved for prayer. Her teacher, Miss Patel, had once told the class that Sophia had an understanding that felt old. Sophia shrugged and kept working. She loved the quiet ritual of solving problems that had answers, unlike the messy negotiations adults lived with. There was a small room in the Mendoza apartment where textbooks were stacked like trophies.
Maria cooked under the watchful eye of a calendar, with marks showing every time they had stretched money to pay for a science camp or a new piece of equipment Sophia wanted. Carlos kept his tools in a battered toolbox and would come home smelling like lemon cleaner, a scent so tied to him that it could have been a second name. He was proud of his work and more proud of the daughter who read his manuals and wanted to know how the lights worked. In the building, Sophia had earned small privileges. Miguel, the security guard with soft hands and a laugh like a hinge, sometimes let her sit in the security office and watch the feeds while he finished his rounds. He told her stories about the ways the building hummed when the night was quiet. "This place has a rhythm," he told her one night, folding a newspaper over his knees. "You listen long enough, you can tell when something's off." She listened. At the same time, culturally, the company was a fortress of hierarchy. Titles mattered as if they were talismans. People used words like protocol and escalation, phrases that sounded like armor. There were staff who had worked there for years who were not allowed into certain rooms. There were doors that opened only with badges that cost a higher salary than some households earned in a year. In those places, the maintenance team was invisible. Carlos and his co-workers cleaned away the mess of success. Coffee spills, discarded name tags, the crumbs of meetings. There was dignity in their labor, but there was also an economy of notice. If the janitor left, the world kept going, until at some point it didn't. Marcus exploited that invisibility. He believed with a kind of clinical certainty that people who worked with their hands were predictable and that the company belonged to those who could seize it. He had been building his own case for power the way an architect draws plans, carefully, silently, always keeping his cards close. Marcus saw Richard's moment of weakness as possibility. He had allies in the middle management who admired his ruthlessness. He had resentments too, a kind that swelled quietly because of slights, and some whispers, biases that filtered into how he saw others. It was a dangerous combination. After the initial panic, the board demanded answers. Business continuity plans slid across tables. Specialists ran diagnostics that churned to no immediate conclusion.
In a technical briefing, engineers used words like anomalous signature and privilege escalation in clipped tones that communicated competence without committing explains. David outlined what he needed: deeper forensic analysis, cross-checking of logs, a search for non-standard access. Marcus nodded and suggested external infiltration, foreign entities, sophisticated attackers. It was a tidy explanation that placed blame somewhere outside the walls, where it was less embarrassing for those inside. But some things didn't add up.
Sophia had noticed how Marcus's schedule had odd pockets. Brief disappearances during low traffic hours, a pattern to his coffee orders that synchronized with certain maintenance activity. She'd seen him exit through doors marked authorized personnel with a tilt in his stride that suggested he wanted to be seen as belonging. She had scribbled small observations, little notations like a child keeping a nature log. Marcus, late. Miguel, gave book. Server light blinking, odd. The notes were insignificant in the eyes of executives. They were treasure to a mind that looked for jigsaws. When the company started losing data, it wasn't just numbers on a screen. People who worked in the payroll department began to panic. One mother of two called into work with a quavering voice and said the direct deposits hadn't gone through. Another employee lost the ghost of a promotion because their files were scrambled. These were the lives behind the dashboards. For Sophia, the stakes were no longer abstract. Someone's rent could be late, someone's medication could go unaffordable. Inside the emergency command center, tempers rose. Richard felt like someone had stolen a page from his own life. Reporters camped outside. His assistant tried to keep a composed front for the cameras. Marcus presented a calm face and a plan: external forensics and a staged recovery process. He recommended isolating systems, moving to backups, and waiting. David pushed back. Waiting gives an attacker time to bury their tracks, he said. We need to determine if this came from within. Privileged credentials leave a signature. But the signatures can be forged, Marcus countered smoothly. He had rehearsed this. The room could smell the lines of prior practice. We can't assume internal. We can't damage our relationships with clients by making a public accusation without evidence. Do we have evidence that it's external? David asked. No one offered proof. The company was full of professionals whose job it was to hedge risk and avoid blame. The dynamic created a kind of paralysis. They were excellent at contingency plans. They were less adept at seeing what was in front of them when it contradicted their assumptions. Sophia watched that paralysis like a fault line. From the stairwell, she could hear voices thicken with technobabble and thin with fear. She could see the neat lines of responsibility fraying at the edges. And she could see Marcus, always a step ahead in his composure. It made her stomach ache in a way that was not simply annoyance. It felt dangerous. She decided then, quietly and without fanfare, that if adults would not look, she would. The decision came from small things: an interest in how sequences repeated, a set of books that gave her language for thinking, the memory of Miguel's patient admonition to notice the rhythm of the place. She didn't think of heroism, she thought of duty.
That evening, after the sun had left the windows in long orange bars and the emergency lights flickered on, the building resettled into a strange, uncertain calm. Tech staff left in clusters, their faces taut with stress. Security tightened its patrols. The maintenance crew emptied the bins like ghosts. Carlos came home later than usual, smelling of lemon and the faint ozone of servers. He sat at the kitchen table and unfolded his lunch like a ritual. Maria looked at him with a softness that was also armor and said simply, "They will manage. They always do." Sophia watched him. She loved him more than she said. He had given her the key to his world, a physical key that opened doors not just of metal, but of access and trust. It was a worn, indifferent thing, with his name stamped on it, and a rivulet of scratches like country roads scarred by travel. He had let her carry it when she was 9 and curious, trusting that she would be careful. She looked at the key now and wondered if it could unlock the silence in the conference room. She sat at her small desk that night with a lamp and a stack of books. Miguel had given her one earlier, a slim manual that explained, in legal and general terms, how computer systems keep records. Not the how-to of exploiting them, but the idea that records leave traces. She read aloud to herself the metaphors. A system is like a diary. Each action leaves a footprint. She repeated the phrases as if learning prayers. She mapped the building in her head, floor by floor, the places she had been allowed to go, and the places she had only ever peered into through half-closed doors. A plan formed that was more clever than dangerous. Sophia didn't imagine herself doing anything explosive. She imagined observation and evidence, finding the traces that would point away from the comforting outside origin and toward the truth. She wanted to find the kind of paper trail that could not be faked by bluster. She wanted to find the place where an advanced program had been given life, and then point to where that life had been hidden. She thought of risk, not like a movie heroine with a cape, but like someone considering whether to cross a busy street. She told her parents she might go back to the building tonight to pick up a notebook she had left at the maintenance office. Carlos looked at her with a long, long look. He had no illusions about the world. He knew it could be cruel. He also knew his daughter the way certain people know the weather. "I will wait downstairs," he said, finally. "If you go, you tell me when you leave." "It will be quick," she said. "Quick stays quick until it isn't," he said. The sentence was an old, practical prayer. She kissed his cheek and stepped into the night. The building looked different after hours. Fluorescent corridors were empty, and the hum of corporate life retreated to a low, mechanical whisper. Emergency lights cast the polished floors in a sickly blue.
Security cameras observed with the impartiality of owls. Sophia moved through the halls with the quiet of someone who had practiced opening doors with a hand that belonged there. She held the key like a relic, its metal cold and familiar in her palm. She went to places she had only ever peeked into: a ladder closet with a smell of paint, the loading docks where deliveries arrived, a floor with servers that thrummed like distant engines. Doors that were always closed to the public clicked open with familiar keys and remote latches. Sophia kept her steps measured. She did not imagine herself invulnerable, only precise. When she reached the server room, the air changed. It smelled faintly of ozone and plastic, a sterile scent that could have been described as clean, but felt instead like a city at night. Lights blinked in neat arrays, and the racks rose like columns in a cathedral. She felt like a small animal entering a vast landscape. Her hand brushed a cooling fan, the skin on her knuckles prickling with the electrical hum. Intelligence occupied the room in a way that felt solemn. She moved to the nearest terminal, one that wasn't locked behind a badge but sat idle, its screen waiting like a blank face. She wasn't there to break anything. She was there to look, to trace, to see if the diary of the system had a mark someone had tried to scrub clean. Her eyes flicked through interfaces the way she had learned in books, looking for irregularities in the shapes rather than trying to read commands. She scanned entry times, access points, notes left by hands that wanted to hide. And then she saw something that made her stomach drop. Not a line of code, but an author tag, a small, stubborn signature that an adult might have missed. The tag read like a name. It wasn't the kind of thing a machine creates out of malice. It was the kind of careless human mark someone leaves when they want credit, or when they believe they are above being traced. Sophia felt her breath pull inward. This was the kind of thing that did not belong on a log if the perpetrator had thought themselves careful. Someone had left their mark. She dug deeper, moving through archived entries and timestamps, feeling like a detective of biscuits and crumbs. What she found suggested a pattern of access aligned with a person's schedule, a pattern that mirrored Marcus's brief pockets of absence. There was also a reference, oblique and bureaucratic, to a transfer, and a set of communications that referenced partners in the industry. The emails were terse and apologetic in tone, like a letter written under an instruction to be casual. Her hands trembled. She knew this wasn't the proof needed for a courtroom, and she also knew it was the kind of evidence that could not be explained away with the company's preferred narrative. It had the texture of someone's arrogance caught like a breath on a mirror. Sophia saved what she could. A copy here, a screenshot there. She didn't do anything complex. She made duplicates in plain, obvious ways so someone else could see them and not claim the sighting was a trick. She thought of Miguel's words about the rhythm of the building and kept searching for the beat. And then, buried under an innocuous label, she found a notation that made the blood in her face go cold, a scheduled routine set to initiate at a future time, one that would clear certain data repositories. The label was bureaucratic and dry. Its intention was not. It was a threat wrapped in the language of maintenance. She closed the terminal and sat back on a bench, her legs thin and songless under the fluorescent light. She could imagine, very clearly, the cascading effect of that scheduled routine. It would look to outside experts like a neat deletion, a system error, a purge. No one in the conference room would suspect that the hand that pressed the button was wearing a suit. She felt a wild, fierce kind of anger then. Not the enviable passion of the young avenger, but a precise indignation. It was not for herself. It was for the people who would lose grocery money, mortgages, small futures. She thought of her father's hands, the way he kept his calluses like old coins. In the hush of the server room, Sophia made a decision. Evidence had meaning only when it was visible. She could be clever and hide in the shadows, or she could be the voice that pointed and said, "This is what is happening." She began to copy everything she could, to download small packets of data into a flash drive. Nothing sophisticated, nothing that resembled instruction. She took the copies as she would gather seeds for a garden, not to weaponize, but to plant in a place where they could be seen to grow. Then, as she was gathering the last file, she heard footsteps in the corridor, footsteps too measured to be the slack, distracted shuffle of a night cleaner. They were the kind of sound that belonged to someone checking their own plans. She froze. Her skin tightened, listening. A shadow moved across the frosted glass of the server room door. The footsteps were getting closer. Sophia looked at the racks and at the terminal and at the list she'd made in her head. She had no illusions about what confrontation might look like. Adults had built walls that kept conclusions away from her family for years. This wasn't about bravado, it was about truth, and truth needed witnesses. She tucked the drive into her pocket and slid to the floor where a mop closet offered cover. Her breath became a thing she could hear. She could not tell if the shadow belonged to security making his late rounds, or if it belonged to Marcus, returning from some late-night rehearsal of innocence. She told herself to keep still, to be patient like the moon she had watched from her window 1,000 nights. The footsteps paused outside the door. Her heart clattered in her throat like a silver coin in a tin.
The handle turned slowly, and a pair of shoes appeared in the small window. The shoes belonged to a man she knew. Marcus. His face, visible through the glass, was unreadable. For a second, a single, terrible thought crossed Sophia's mind. What if she had been wrong? What if the mark she found was an accident, a misattributed signature that would expose her to ridicule? She thought of the way adults dismissed her in meetings with a polite smile as they discussed disaster recovery. She thought of Carlos and Maria and the way they counted on steadiness rather than drama. Marcus pushed the door open. He stepped into the room, glanced at the racks, and then turned toward the terminal. His eyes moved across the screen in a way that made Sophia feel like she had been seen. He approached the desk, and as his hand hovered over the keyboard, a tightness formed in the air. Sophia's world narrowed to a single choice: run and hope someone would believe a child's frantic account, or step out and put evidence on a table in a room full of people who had the power to act. She slid from the closet and walked toward the door. Her feet were quiet, the key in her pocket pressed like a pulse. Marcus looked up before she reached the threshold. The expression on his face shifted from surprise to something that could have been amusement, and then recalibrated into danger. He took a step toward her, words forming in a mouth that had rehearsed many skilled defenses. "What are you doing here?" he asked, and his voice was smooth, as though he were interrogating a misplaced piece of equipment. Sophia held his gaze. "I was looking at the logs," she said, her voice steady because she had decided on steadiness as a strategy. "There are traces. They match your schedule patterns." The words landed like thrown pebbles into a bowl. Marcus's mouth tightened. He leaned in, a motion that was meant to displace her, to make her feel smaller by proximity. "Child," he said, his tone a mixture of condescension and warning, "you shouldn't be here." "Someone's going to lose a paycheck," she said. "Someone's going to lose their job if they can't prove what happened. I found plans to clear files. It starts in 48 hours. The number in the air made Marcus's face register real emotion, fear, quick and raw, before he masked it again. He straightened and stepped back. In the cold, sterile light, he made a decision. "You shouldn't jump to accusations," he said. "You could be mistaken." Sophia slid the flash drive from her pocket and laid it on the desk between them. Marcus's eyes flicked to it, then to the terminal. For a terrifying moment it seemed that he might crush the device, destroy the only tangible thing she had. Instead, he flexed his fingers, like a man considering chess moves. "This doesn't belong to you," Marcus said. "It belongs to everyone who works here," Sophia answered.
A siren in the distance, perhaps the security office reacting to motion, made both of them look toward the door. It was time for decisions. Marcus's jaw tightened. He made another little syllable of calculation. "You should stay away," he warned, as if he could cloak the threat in common sense. Sophia's shadow pooled with his. She could have fled. She could have called the one person she trusted in the world, her father. But the knowledge of the scheduled routine felt like a lit fuse. Hiding this truth felt like letting a room burn down while standing with a bucket that wasn't quite big enough. She turned and walked out of the server room with the flash drive in her pocket, and the corridor swallowed her small shape. Marcus watched her go,
and the light in his face was not the light of a man relieved, but rather of one who had leaned into a plan and now found his narrative challenged. Across the building, doors opened and closed. Staff moved from one emergency meeting to the next. Nobody yet understood how close they had come to an irrevocable loss. In a few hours, heads would meet around a table, and arguments would be made, and lawyers would think in paragraphs of contingency. The company had a chance to be saved. Sophia moved back into the night with an instrument that was both fragile and undeniable, evidence, and a will to show it. Her feet were quiet as she reached the service elevator. Somewhere below, her father finished a late job, pushing a cart with a rhythm she knew by heart. She wanted to tell him everything, to lay out the files like cards on the kitchen table and say, see what they planned. But she also knew how people would react, pity or disbelief. She needed corroboration from someone who could read what she had found. She needed an adult who believed in what evidence did when it mattered. The elevator hummed down. Outside, the night had settled into a cold, expectant silence. The city lights cut across windows like soft accusations. Sophia tucked the drive into her pocket and thought of how thin the line between being invisible and being necessary could be. Behind her, inside a building designed to resist the world, a man who tried to take it for himself found his assumptions disrupted. He would not take the loss well. He might strike. He might manipulate. He might double down. That was how people like him behaved when the story they had written about themselves was under threat. Sophia pushed the door open into the loading dock and found Miguel waiting, leaning against a pillar with his hat in his hand. He looked like he'd been waiting for her, because somehow he had the patience to read the small weather of the building. "You look like a storm," he said, half a joke. "It's small," she said, and then, with a gravity she had practiced. "But it is true." Miguel nodded, his face unreadable. "You brought proof?" She handed him the drive. His fingers closed over it as if it were a fragile bird. "Be careful," he said. He watched her, not like a man watching a child, but like someone watching a comrade. Don't make this your fight alone. She wanted so badly to tell him she was not looking for glory. She wanted to protect people, to make the truth visible. But those sentences are heavy, and she was only 12 and hadn't learned how to unpack them yet. Instead, she said, "I need someone who'll listen." Miguel's nod was a small game of faith. "Then we'll make sure they hear." They walked into the night like two people carrying a secret in the only way that made sense, by moving with it toward a place where it could be seen. In the conference room the next morning, the company prepared for another day of crisis. Richard Sterling slept for 10 minutes at his desk and woke with a face that looked older. Marcus arrived with the same calm as ever. David had stayed through the night in the operations center, poring over what limited data had been available. He was not the kind of man to be moved by theatrics. He sought facts. The board demanded an update. The PR team demanded a statement. The retail clients wanted a bridge, something to hold the panic at bay. Sophia walked through the lobby as though she belonged, and for the first time in her life, the look she got from reception wasn't one of polite dismissal, but of careful curiosity. Miguel had arranged for someone to be present when she arrived. She felt bigger than she had thought possible, as if the building had given her permission. When she stepped into the conference room, there were eyes on her, curious, skeptical, worried. Marcus's face hardened in a way that no one could hide. He watched her the way a chess player watches a pawn move that might be a queen in disguise. Sophia walked to the lectern and asked, politely and without drama, for a few moments. For a breathless second, the room held what she had been waiting for, the possibility that someone would listen. Marcus smiled like a man watching a child's recital and told her curtly that she shouldn't be there. But other faces in the room, faces of employees whose paychecks had been endangered, faces of people who had spent late nights in front of screens trying to salvage something, looked at her not like a child's distraction, but like a lever. She placed the flash drive on the lectern and said simply, "I found evidence. It shows that this was not an external attack." As gasps moved through the room like a sound wave, she felt the weight of the moment balance on the small disk at her fingertips. It was not the end of the story. It was the opening of one. Outside the building, the city continued, indifferent and grand. Inside, new consequences were waking. People were choosing which side of history to be on. And somewhere, hidden in a watchful glance and a tightening jaw, a man who had planned to reshape the company discovered that his designs were suddenly at risk. Sophia had not finished the work. No one was safe yet.
But the first clear, sharp light had been thrown onto something that had been growing in the dark. The coming hours would be messy. Lawyers and agents, PR and apologies, evidentiary battles. For now, Sophia stood on the lectern with small shoulders and an even smaller voice that had somehow become enormous in the stillness. Someone reached for a microphone. A lawyer checked notes. Marcus moved as if to intercept. The room leaned in. Marcus moved before anyone else could think to stop him. He reached for the lectern as if he could snatch the moment into his hands and pry it apart. For a heartbeat, the room smelled like ozone and old paper, the scent of decisions being remade. Sophia kept her eyes on the faces in the conference room and not on the man lunging toward her. She had rehearsed one truth in her head. Evidence speaks louder than authority. "Don't touch it," she said, and her voice carried because people wanted it to be true. Marcus's hand closed on the flash drive first. He turned it as if testing its weight. His smile was gone. Something harder sat behind his eyes. "This is an invasion," he said. "This is hacking. You have no idea what you hold." David Chen stepped forward without theatricality. He had been listening, always listening, and he looked at the drive with a professional calm. "Let me see it," he said. Marcus hesitated. He glanced at the board, at the cluster of faces, some horrified, some stunned, a few calculating. He made a movement that was a claimed attempt to protect the company, an effortless pivot to the language of duty. "We can't hand over company data to a child," he said, as if that explained everything. "We need protocol. This needs to be handled by forensic teams." Richard Sterling, who had been sitting as if the weight of the building pressed into his ribs, stood up slowly. He had that look of a man cataloging the cost of humility. "We will have protocol," he said, and there was a steadiness there that hadn't been present before. "But we also have to know the truth. We will not allow anyone to intimidate employees or silence evidence." The room held its breath. An assistant reached for a secure tray of devices, and someone in the back whispered that the legal team was dialing the federal contact they had for emergencies. The word evidence had turned the water under Marcus's feet into a storm. Marcus's fingers tightened on the drive. He tried to make his face a mask of control. "If you're implying I've done something." Sophia didn't answer with accusations. She put her hands on the lectern and slid the drive toward the center where cameras could pick up the movement. "It shows access that matches your schedule," she said. "It shows communications. It shows a routine set to clear files. It shows transfers to outside partners. It shows—" She swallowed and found the phrase that stripped the last of the room's patience for excuses. "A plan to sell company secrets and white payroll."
The last words landed like a dropped gavel. A woman in human resources put her hand to her mouth. Someone near the window whispered, "Payroll?" as if it were a prophecy. A murmur spread, people leaning toward reality, toward the possibility that what they feared had been planned from within. David reached for the drive with the authority of a person called to a problem that had answers within reach. He did not touch it like a civilian. He rotated it as gently as if it were glass, and then he dipped into the files and started to read aloud. Not code, but the meaning of a set of documents. Correspondences referencing transfers to third-party accounts, timeline alignments, and server logs that show authorized access with a campus credential. He didn't explain how the logs worked. He explained what they said. Marcus flinched and then hardened. He moved toward the door, the kind of movement people make when they decide the next scene will be in court rather than a conference room. "You have no jurisdiction here for a public spectacle," he said. "This is internal. We will handle it internally." "You're not handling anything," Sarah Williams, a line manager whose team had been threatened by the payroll error, said. Her voice was small and fierce. "People are already late on rent. You don't get to make this smaller." Marcus's jaw worked. He threw a look at the nearest security officer, a man with a badge and tired eyes who had been taught that the job of security was to maintain order, not to pick sides. The officer looked at the board and then at the flash drive. "Call the authorities," David said quietly, and the phrase broke the room's tension like a flood scouring sand. "We need an independent investigation, right now." Someone in the back of the room was already dialing. Richard's hand slid toward his phone like a man finding an anchor. Within minutes, agents arrived, officials in plain suits who moved with steady, practiced focus. Agent Johnson introduced himself, set a quiet perimeter, and asked for the digital media to be secured. He listened to David summarize what had been found.
He listened to Sophia, who told the story plainly, how she'd been in the server room, the tag she'd seen, the scheduled routine. He asked questions that were calm and precise. Not forensics, not technical directions, questions about timeline and witness. Marcus realized, in the way men in power sometimes realize too late, that his narrative had broken. The room saw the whole. He stepped toward a different exit, the one that led to the stairwell and to a set of doors that opened onto a side lot. If anyone wanted to disappear a moment, there were ways for someone with a suit and an appointment to step out and never be seen again. Marcus did not run gracefully. He pushed past a table, his elbow knocking down a water glass that spun and shattered, a sound like the final sentence of a speech. Security moved to intercept.
Marcus shoved past a tall young engineer who tried to block his path, and then he tried to burst through the door. That was the moment when human dignity inside a large room turned into a decision. A security officer grabbed Marcus's arm and tried to hold him back. Marcus shoved back and lashed out, a brief physicality that was ugly and clumsy. He had not rehearsed violence. He'd rehearsed narratives. 2 officers delayed him, and in the scramble, a man in a suit tried to pull Marcus away and was knocked to the floor. For a breath, the room became a place where people made decisions with their bodies as much as their words. Agent Johnson moved forward with the authority of someone who had seen this movie too many times. "Sir, you're under investigation. We need you to stay," he said. Marcus laughed, a thin, sharp sound that did not fit the seriousness. He tried to wrench free. A second agent, arriving after an official call, handcuffed him. Marcus's face went from red to a pallor that had panic in it. He attempted words, claims of conspiracy, of being framed, but his voice sounded like it had been prepared for a press release, not a moment on the ground. Security let him out. In the hallway, voices followed, incredulous, relieved, angry. Someone shouted that he should be fired. Someone else argued for due process. Agent Johnson told them both that the federal investigation would determine the next stunts, and that the legal machinery would take its due course. He acknowledged the emotional stakes, nodded to the payroll team, and then pulled Richard aside. "We need preservation of evidence. No system changes without us," he said, professional and blunt. Richard nodded with an emptiness that was almost relief. In the conference room, the atmosphere shifted from theatrical to practical. Meetings were called with a new kind of urgency, the one that comes when something that had been assumed invisible turns out to be real. David's team began to operate alongside the agents, cross-checking and validating without dramatics. They confirmed that the files were not the product of clever external forgery. The markers traced back to internal credentials and timelines matching Marcus's access windows. Legal counsel counseled patience, but staff wanted answers now. Sophia felt a complicated thing in her chest, and elation laced with a strange sorrow. She had been counted out, and now the truth was visible. But the room was also heavy with the knowledge that many people had already been hurt. She thought of the mother who'd called to say her paycheck was gone. She thought of the clerk who had lost her promotion. She thought of the bathrooms her father had cleaned. Evidence had given voice to these invisible harms. Richard met her eyes across the lectern. For a moment he stood like a man who had found a ledger with his name owed on both sides. "You did the right thing," he said, and the words were small and sincere. "I'm sorry this happened on my watch."
Sophia's response was not triumph. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "Miguel helped. My father." She looked for him across the room, but he wasn't there yet. He had been told to stay home until the worst of the day passed. She thought of the forgotten people, of quiet dignity. "We need to make sure the people who were hurt are made whole, and that this can't happen again." Richard swallowed. People in the room shifted. A director of operations cleared his throat and began to list options: immediate payroll rectification, emergency funds for affected employees, and a public statement promising an independent audit of governance. It was corporate language at first, but then it crested into responsibility. He looked at the cameras in the room and then at Sophia. "We will be transparent," he said. "All decisions will involve independent oversight, and we will begin by helping those who lost income." Legal steps followed. Internal suspensions were announced. Agent Johnson oversaw chains of custody for devices. The board convened an emergency meeting and then, under public pressure, agreed to open a full external review. Statements were drafted in careful language, but with a new note: humility. Marcus's hiding places were being lit. His communications with outside partners were being examined. The papers that suggested his racist thinking, that cast others as disposable, were paraphrased by those reading them aloud, never repeated in full. Their ugliness translated into the room with precision but without propagation. The pattern of arrogance, manipulation, and greed fit together like pieces in a mold. For Sophia, the immediacy of the day folded into something quieter. After hours of interviews, by security, by legal counsel, by agents, she sat in a small, stark room with David and Agent Johnson. They validated what she'd found and asked for her notes. They asked who had helped her. She spoke plainly of Miguel and Carlos. David listened and then said, "You did what many didn't. You observed, you documented." This is what saves organizations, people who care enough to notice. Agent Johnson put a card in front of her. We're going to need a formal statement, he said. He smiled in a way that made him look younger. Not for the cameras, for the record. You'll get support. We won't let a child take this burden alone. The family received the call in the small kitchen the way a family receives a large and complicated thing, with a mix of joy and an exhaustion that comes from nights of work and days of waiting. Carlos set his mop down and studied his daughter the way one reads a face in a family album. Maria made coffee as if ritual could smooth jagged edges. When Sophia walked in, they surrounded her with a softness that had always been the world's most reliable currency for them. You were brave, Carlos said, and his hand was rough on the back of her head, a public and private blessing. You made me proud. Maria kissed her.
We are very proud of you, she said, voice steady. But promise us you'll be careful. Sophia promised. She had not imagined being a public figure. She had not wanted to be a spectacle. She had wanted to make a thing right and return to the quiet work of learning. But life shifts in ways that require new maps. In the days that followed, Techdyne moved like a ship correcting course. The company issued public apologies, measured, then overflowing with detail, as Richard Sterling spoke in a recorded message that sounded less polished and more human than the usual executive communications. He acknowledged failed oversight, promised structural changes, and committed funds for affected employees. He met privately with a group of janitorial staff and with mainline employees who had been made visible by the revelation. He listened in a way that people don't always see executives listen. He took notes as if the paper could carry the weight of promises. Change begins with seeing, he said in an internal email that later leaked as the company took steps to be transparent. We failed to see what was in front of us. The board announced that Marcus Thompson had been suspended pending federal investigation and that an internal code of conduct review would be led by an independent committee. Agents continued to work through evidence. Legal counsel clarified that charges had been filed and that the Department of Justice would determine prosecution, leaving the court to its stages. The company set up an emergency payroll fund and contracted a financial firm to process immediate payouts. The HR team, under new oversight, began to call each affected employee. There were small ceremonies that felt like stitches. Carlos was asked to speak at a town hall in a room he'd always cleaned. He stood behind a microphone that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and said simply, "We all want the same things. We want to be seen." People applauded, and it wasn't a choreography of corporate PR. It was a real sound of people discovering themselves in a larger narrative. Sophia received offers, scholarship programs from universities, an invitation to consult in a youth advisory role on corporate responsibility, and a quiet proposal from a nonprofit to create after-school programs for kids like her. She declined some offers politely. She accepted one generous scholarship that would let her attend a science camp she had dreamed of. David Chen, who had been her advocate through the process, recommended that she be given a formal mentorship stipend and access to training, not as a trophy, but as recognition of preparation. Richard pinned a small commendation on her school's notice board and arranged for Techdyne to cover extracurricular expenses for a cohort of students. Marcus was escorted into custody, not like a showman, but like a man whose props had been removed.
The press circled, the legal filings multiplied, and one of the narratives the public debated was not merely the theft, but the way institutions had allowed invisibility to cloak wrongdoing. There were opinion pieces and op-eds that argued both for due process and for structural change. The company faced lawsuits, and there were victims who sought restitution. None of the actors guaranteed outcomes beyond the next step. The machinery of justice moved predictably in its slowness. In the weeks after, Techdyne made systemic changes that were more than statements. They changed access protocols in ways that required oversight, instituted mandatory rotation for privileged credentials, and created an employee fund to cover immediate family hardships in crises. They committed to regular audits by outside bodies and to forming a liaison committee that included frontline workers and janitorial staff, the people whose perspectives had been invisible. The board voted to fund community scholarships and pledged transparency in reporting. These measures did not erase harm, but they were gestures toward repair. Publicly, Richard Sterling stepped into a narrative that was new for him. He met with the Mendozas not as a brand, but as a man who had been made smaller by truth, and therefore possibly wiser. He sat at their small kitchen table and did what some executives never do. He listened without an agenda. He asked about their family and about what they needed. He told them plainly that he had failed to notice things he should have seen. "We want dignity for everyone who works in this building," he told them, voice hoarse in the way of someone who had spent weeks speaking to cameras. "If there's anything Techdyne can do, rightly and properly, to help, we will." Carlos accepted the offer not for show but for stability. The company extended a contract to the building maintenance team that included steady hours and healthcare benefits, things that had always been on the table in fiscal spreadsheets but never had someone to champion them.
Richard arranged for funds to provide scholarships in Sophia's name. He wouldn't shorthand it as retention, but he acknowledged the debt. Richard also committed the company to invest in community technology programs that would create a pipeline of diverse talent, both to do good and to correct the institutional blindness that allowed Marcus's plan to take root. The legal consequences for Marcus unfolded with the careful machinery of law. He was indicted on charges that included fraud and conspiracy. The Department of Justice pursued the case with the same methodical focus Agent Johnson had hinted at in the early days. The press followed the trial, but the focus shifted away from spectacle toward questions about corporate governance and workplace culture. Marcus's defense argued entrapment and scapegoating. Prosecutors presented documents and witness testimony. The system was not theatrical. It was long and deliberate.
The company settled some claims, contested others, and paid fines where regulation demanded. Some executives left. Some were retained under new oversight. None of these things erased the sting that had arrived in the first week when payrolls didn't clear. But they built a different future. People who had felt unseen were now in conversation. Men and women who had once been paid by pennies and silence now had a seat at committees that would decide policies affecting their work. It was imperfect. It was human. The epilogue came not as a single scene, but as a string of small human images that stitched the story into a new fabric. At the Mendoza's apartment, a modest party gathered with neighbors and co-workers. Plates of tamales and cake passed between people who had learned each other's names during crisis. Carlos made a toast that was more prayer than speech. "To the ones who notice," he said, voice growing. "To the ones who do not wait for permission to act." Sophia sat at the head of the small table, a book beside her plate. She was tired in a way that homework and heroism combined to make a child tired. Her friends came by from school, hovering and proud. Miguel attended quietly, a content smile on his face. David visited not as a consultant, but as someone who had found in this child a reason to keep doing the work he did, protecting systems with the humanity that technology sometimes forgets. Richard Sterling dropped by later that evening with a small bouquet of supermarket flowers, a clumsily human gesture. He stood in the doorway, looking at the party as if at a small, newly built cathedral. "I owe you all an apology," he said, "and more than that, I owe action." Sophia looked at him and felt, perhaps for the first time in the year, that someone with power was trying to bend it toward justice. She accepted the apology the way people accept shelter, gratefully, and with the expectation that warmth will have to be sustained. Maria pressed a plate of food into his hands like a blessing. "We do what we can," she said. "We watch out for each other." The camera of memory settles on Sophia then, small hands, braid catching the last light, a child who had watched patterns and acted. She wasn't a miracle in the sense of sudden omnipotence. She was a person who learned and paid attention, and who, at a certain juncture, chose responsibility over invisibility. The world continued to hum. Techdyne would never be the same. Some saw that as a loss, others as a necessary shedding. The story that had started with screens going black ended with someone turning on lights that had always been there, people looking at each other and finally seeing. There were quiet reckonings still to occur, lawsuits, internal reviews, the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust. But standing in the doorway of their small apartment, surrounded by neighbors, Sophia felt a soft strength.
The future that had felt thin and precarious the week before now had measurable weight. The promise of funding for her education, the knowledge that her father had a more secure schedule, the sense that a child's curiosity could be the thing that nudged a giant into better behavior. Before the credits of life roll, people make choices to notice, to hold accountable, to repair. People like Sophia choose the path of preparation and attention. People like Carlos teach their children not by speeches, but by working
and by refusing to shrink. People like Richard found the humility to change how he saw his company. People like Marcus faced the long arc of legal consequence, all the while making the rest of the organization re-examine itself. If you watched this story with your heart open, you saw a small truth. Dignity isn't measured by title, and intelligence doesn't wear a suit. There are Sophias in many places, in hospitals, in schools, in office buildings, quietly learning and waiting for an opportunity to make the world safer and fairer. When those moments come, we would do well to notice, to listen, and to ensure that their cost is not paid by their childhood. If this underdog story stirred something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that small acts matter. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary courage, and tell us in the comments about a Sophia in your life who deserves to be seen.